At the bottom of the world lies a continent that appears silent, frozen, and empty. It is often described as timeless, as if it has always existed outside ordinary history. Yet this impression comes from what can be seen, not from what is preserved. Beneath kilometers of ice rests a landscape shaped before the cold became permanent. Rivers once moved across it. Shorelines formed and held their shape. Soil gathered, weathered, and settled. These are not traces of imagination. They are measured, mapped, and confirmed through modern science. What remains uncertain is not whether Antarctica changed, but how it functioned during those earlier intervals. This documentary does not argue for lost cities or dramatic collapse. It examines quieter possibilities. How climate shifted, how access narrowed, how memory outlasted contact, and how a continent became sealed without erasing what came before. What follows is not a story of discovery, but of preservation. When the world was temperate, for most of the last 2 centuries, the southern pole has been described as timelessly frozen. Textbooks present it as a land that never changed, sealed beneath ice since before human memory. Yet this image is recent. Geological records tell a slower and quieter story, one that does not begin with ice, but with water, soil, and seasons. Core samples drilled from deep beneath the Antarctic ice sheet reveal layers of pollen, spores, and ancient plant matter. These layers are not scattered or accidental. They form long, ordered sequences. Some date to periods between 14,000 and 40,000 years ago. Others reach much deeper, to more than 1 million years before the present. The plants they describe could not survive in permanent darkness or extreme cold. They suggest a climate that shifted gradually, not suddenly. In 1947, a joint American expedition recovered sediment cores from the Ross Sea. Within them were traces of beach pollen. This type of tree today grows in temperate zones, far from polar conditions. Similar findings were later confirmed by British and New Zealand teams. The results were quietly published in scientific journals, then filed into climate discussions rather than historical ones. Maps produced before the 19th century complicate the picture further. Several early charts depict a southern landmass without ice along its coasts. One of the most cited is a 1513 map attributed to an Ottoman admiral who claimed to compile much older sources. The coastlines shown on this map align in several places with modern radar scans of Antarctica beneath the ice. This alignment remains debated, but the resemblance persists. Radar surveys conducted during the Cold War added new detail. Using ice-penetrating technology, researchers identified river valleys, lake beds, and broad plains beneath more than a mile of ice. These features are not random fractures. They follow patterns shaped by flowing water over long periods. Some valleys stretch for hundreds of miles and show signs of erosion inconsistent with glacial movement alone. The largest of these hidden formations lies beneath East Antarctica. There, researchers mapped what appears to be a vast basin bordered by elevated ridges. Within it are traces of ancient drainage systems. In satellite images, these forms are faint but continuous, suggesting they existed before ice reshaped the surface. The ice did not carve them, it preserved them. Climate reconstructions indicate that Antarctica once occupied a different position relative to global wind and ocean currents. Before the opening of certain southern passages, warm currents moved closer to the pole. Heat was distributed differently. Ice accumulation was seasonal, not permanent. In such conditions, land exposure would have lasted thousands of years at a time. Human presence in extreme latitudes has traditionally been dismissed due to assumed limitations. Yet evidence from the Arctic shows that early humans adapted to cold far earlier than once believed. Sites in northern Eurasia indicate seasonal occupation during harsh climates more than 30,000 years ago. These populations were mobile, skilled, and observant of long-term environmental rhythms. Stone tools, found in subantarctic islands, add another layer of uncertainty. While none have been conclusively dated to the Antarctic mainland, their presence nearby raises questions about migration routes once opened by land or ice bridges. During periods of lower sea level, distances between southern landmasses were reduced. Travel would have been slow, but not impossible. Ancient traditions from distant cultures speak of a southern land that once held knowledge or people. These accounts are often vague, fragmented, and symbolic. They are not evidence on their own. Yet they echo a recurring idea that something existed before ice closed the region. The language used is calm, not dramatic. It describes withdrawal rather than catastrophe. Geological timelines show that the last major glaciation of Antarctica intensified around 12,000 years ago. This timing overlaps with global climate shifts seen elsewhere. Sea levels rose, habitats contracted, populations migrated. In other regions, this period marks the end of certain ways of life and the quiet disappearance of others. What remains under Antarctic ice is not ruins or cities visible to the eye. It is structure at a different scale, terraces shaped by water, rock formations that suggest long-term exposure, sediment layers that show repeated cycles of growth and decay. These are not signs of sudden occupation, but of endurance. In 2004, a European drilling project recovered microbial life from ice more than 3 kilometers deep. These organisms were dormant, preserved for immense spans of time. Their survival indicates that the ice formed over existing ecosystems rather than erasing them completely. Life adapted downward, layer by layer, as conditions changed. The idea of a buried civilization does not require monuments or written records. It suggests a pattern of living that left subtle marks, ones easily overlooked. Paths worn into soil, seasonal camps near freshwater sources, repeated use of specific landscapes over generations. Such traces would be difficult to detect beneath kilometers of ice. Antarctica's silence is not absolute, it is layered. Beneath the surface is a record of time passing slowly, without interruption. The ice does not hide chaos, it covers continuity. What came before was not erased in a moment. It was gradually sealed, compressed, and preserved. Scientific institutions continue to study the continent as a climate archive. Their focus remains on temperature, sea levels, and atmospheric change. History, when mentioned, is treated as secondary. Yet the ground beneath the ice holds more than data points. It holds context, the shape of a world that once behaved differently. If human presence ever reached this far south, it would not announce itself loudly. It would blend into the land, adapt to long cycles, and withdraw as conditions shifted. The ice would arrive slowly. Camps would be abandoned, paths would vanish, memory would move north, leaving no record behind. The southern pole today appears empty. Wind moves across a surface that seems untouched, yet beneath it lies a landscape shaped before ice ruled the horizon. Its story is quiet, incomplete, and still unfolding. The maps that should not exist, long before satellites traced the outline of the southern pole from orbit, knowledge of the far south moved slowly between human hands. It did not arrive through exploration in the modern sense. It travelled as inheritance. Early mapmakers rarely presented themselves as discoverers. They described their work as compilation. They gathered fragments, copied coastlines, and preserved shapes drawn by others whose names were already lost. What mattered was continuity, not authorship. Medieval and early Renaissance maps often included a large landmass in the far south. Sometimes it appeared as a faint suggestion, a curved edge at the bottom of the page. In other cases, it was drawn with care, showing bays, peninsulas, and interior features. These details appeared centuries before any documented voyage crossed the Antarctic Circle. Historians have usually explained this presence as theoretical balance. A southern continent was thought necessary to counter the weight of the northern lands. Yet some of these maps go beyond balance and abstraction. One of the most frequently discussed examples emerged in the early 16th century. Its compiler wrote that his chart was assembled from about 20 old maps, some of which he claimed dated back to the age of Alexander. This remark is often dismissed as exaggeration or tradition. Still, the southern coastline drawn on this map aligns in several sections with what modern surveys later revealed beneath Antarctic ice. The resemblance is partial, but persistent. The alignment is not perfect. It does not match the modern coastline in full. Yet certain curves recur. Inlets appear where subglacial bays now lie. Proportions between land and sea resemble those measured centuries later using radar. The southern land is shown without ice. It appears surveyed as a coastline shaped by water, not by glaciers extending outward into the ocean. Other maps from the same period repeat similar patterns. A French chart from the mid-16th century depicts a southern continent divided by long river systems. These rivers flow inland from the coast, branching and reconnecting. A later Dutch map shows mountain chains running roughly parallel to the shoreline. These forms resemble features identified beneath the ice using ice-penetrating radar in the 20th century. At the time these maps were drawn, no technology existed to observe such structures. Cartographers of the era worked under significant constraints. Longitude could not be measured accurately. Distances were estimated using dead reckoning. Coastlines were distorted by projection errors. Mistakes were common and expected, yet the southern maps show internal consistency. Rivers do not run uphill. Mountain ranges are placed where elevation would be expected. Coastlines connect logically rather than randomly. The structure suggests copying from an original source rather than imaginative invention. The question of that source remains unresolved. No ancient charts depicting Antarctica have survived. If such documents once existed, they were likely lost to time. Parchment was reused. Libraries were burned. Knowledge was often preserved selectively. Over centuries, material that no longer served immediate needs was discarded. What survived were fragments, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes preserved without context. Some scholars have proposed that ancient navigators reached far southern latitudes during periods of warmer climate. This idea remains controversial, but it does not violate physical law. Ocean currents change over time, wind patterns shift, sea ice retreats and advances. Short windows of access may have existed, lasting centuries rather than millennia. Such windows would leave few archaeological traces, especially in regions later buried under ice. The absence of written accounts is often presented as decisive evidence against early exploration. Yet, much ancient navigation relied on oral transmission. Routes were memorized. Landmarks were described in story and rhythm. Knowledge was restricted to specific groups. Maps were not public documents. They were tools of trade, war, and survival. When a culture declined, its navigational memory often vanished with it. During the 17th century, as European exploration intensified, the southern continent began to disappear from maps. This was not because it had been disproven. It was removed because it could not be confirmed. Cartographers increasingly favored first-hand reports over inherited tradition. Blank space replaced inherited outlines. The unknown was erased rather than questioned. When Antarctica was finally sighted in the 19th century, it was already locked in ice. Explorers encountered towering ice shelves and frozen seas. They did not see the coastlines drawn on older maps. The land beneath was hidden. No one could confirm or deny what earlier charts appeared to show. The older maps were reclassified as curiosities rather than sources. In the 20th century, the question returned quietly. Radar and seismic surveys conducted during the Cold War revealed the shape of the land beneath the ice. Subglacial coastlines emerged. Buried mountain ranges were mapped. In some areas, these hidden forms resembled outlines drawn centuries earlier. Researchers noted the similarity cautiously. Most described it as coincidence. A few acknowledged it as unresolved. Maps do not need to be precise to be meaningful. They preserve intention. They show what someone believed existed or what they were told existed. When multiple independent maps repeat a similar southern form across centuries, it suggests continuity of belief rather than isolated imagination. This continuity itself becomes a historical artifact. These maps do not prove the existence of a civilization at the southern pole. They do not confirm permanent settlement. They do something quieter. They suggest that the southern land was known as land, not myth, known well enough to be drawn without monsters or decoration, known well enough to be treated as geography rather than symbolism. The southern continent did not enter human awareness suddenly. It lingered at the edge of the known world. It was present but unreachable. Its outline was carried forward even as its meaning faded. When ice finally closed access completely, only the inherited shape remained. Cartography records what humans believed was worth remembering. The presence of Antarctica on early maps, detailed beyond necessity, implies attention. Attention implies relevance. The reason for that relevance is not stated. It was assumed, then forgotten. What lies beneath the ice cannot answer questions of authorship or intention. It cannot explain who first traced those coastlines or why. The maps only show that the idea of a livable southern land did not originate in modern times. It arrived already shaped, already accepted, and gradually set aside. The ice did not only cover the land, it covered certainty. What remained were outlines without explanation, copied long enough to survive, then dismissed once they could no longer be tested, a climate that did not always freeze. For much of modern history, Antarctica has been treated as a constant. It is described as a place defined entirely by ice, removed from ordinary climate cycles. This perception is shaped by recent observation rather than long records. When scientists began drilling into the Antarctic ice sheet, they discovered that the frozen surface is only the latest condition in a much longer sequence. Ice cores extracted from East Antarctica contain layered records stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Each layer holds trapped air, dust, and chemical traces that reflect the atmosphere at the time it formed. These layers do not tell a story of permanent cold. They record fluctuation. Periods of deep freeze alternate with intervals of relative warmth. Some of these warmer phases lasted thousands of years. Beneath the ice, sediment cores tell a different story. In several drilling projects, researchers recovered material that could not have formed under present conditions. Pollen grains from grasses, shrubs, and trees appear in distinct layers. These are not contaminants. They are fossilized remnants of vegetation that once grew locally. Their presence indicates exposed land, liquid water, and seasonal light. One of the most significant discoveries came from cores taken near the transantarctic mountains. These samples contained pollen from southern beech trees, a genus that today grows in temperate regions of South America, Australia, and New Zealand. The nearest modern relatives thrive in climates far warmer than Antarctica's current state. The pollen dates to periods between roughly 14,000 and 30,000 years ago, with older layers extending much further back. Marine sediments around the continent add further context. Fossilized plankton species preserved in ocean cores indicate warmer surface waters during certain intervals. These species require temperatures higher than those found in Antarctic waters today. Their repeated appearance suggests recurring warm phases rather than a single anomaly. Plate tectonics also plays a role. Antarctica was not always isolated by cold currents. Millions of years ago, it was connected to other southern landmasses. As these connections broke apart, ocean circulation changed. The opening of southern passages allowed cold currents to form a continuous ring around the continent. This current system now traps cold air and prevents warmer water from reaching the coast. Before this system stabilized, Antarctica experienced mixed conditions. Ice advanced and retreated. Large areas remained ice-free during summer months. Rivers flowed across exposed ground. Lakes formed in low-lying basins. These features are still visible beneath the ice today, mapped through radar surveys that reveal ancient drainage networks. Climate models suggest that even small shifts in ocean circulation can dramatically affect polar conditions. When warm currents move closer to the pole, ice accumulation slows. Snow melts seasonally. Vegetation gains a foothold. These changes do not require tropical heat. They require stability over time. Given enough centuries, ecosystems develop. The last major transition toward permanent ice appears to have accelerated around 12,000 years ago. This period coincides with global climate disruption at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose. Ice sheets collapsed elsewhere. In Antarctica, ice thickened and expanded, sealing the land beneath. The process was gradual. There was no single moment when the continent froze completely. As ice advanced, life adapted downward. Microbial ecosystems retreated into soil and rock. Lakes were sealed beneath ice caps, remaining liquid due to geothermal heat. Some of these subglacial lakes have been isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. They preserve chemical and biological conditions that predate the ice above them. The existence of these lakes challenges assumptions about permanence. If water could remain liquid beneath kilometers of ice, surface conditions must once have allowed far greater exposure. The ice sheet did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated layer by layer, compressing what already existed. Wind patterns also shifted during this transition. Evidence from dust layers shows changing sources of airborne material. During warmer phases, dust originated from local exposed ground. During colder phases, it came from distant continents. This indicates alternating periods of open terrain and complete coverage. These findings have been interpreted primarily through the lens of climate science. Their historical implications are rarely explored. The presence of long-lasting temperate conditions raises questions about what could exist during those intervals. Not cities or monuments, but patterns of movement, seasonal use, and adaptation. Human populations elsewhere responded to similar changes by migrating, clustering, or dispersing. In regions affected by rising ice or flooding, groups followed retreating resources. There is no reason to assume Antarctica would have been exempt from this logic during its warmer phases. The southern continent was not warm in the modern sense. It would have been harsh, unpredictable, and isolated, yet it was not uniformly lethal. Long summers, extended daylight, and accessible coastlines could support temporary habitation. Such use would leave little trace after thousands of years under ice. Climate reconstructions show that these temperate windows occurred repeatedly. Each window opened slowly and closed gradually. Over time, the intervals shortened. Ice gained dominance. The final sealing of the continent did not erase what came before. It buried it intact. Modern Antarctica appears static, but it is the product of motion. Ice flows like a slow river. It grinds, compresses, and preserves. What lies beneath has not been destroyed. It has been paused. Scientific attention remains focused on the ice itself. It is treated as an archive of atmospheric history. The land beneath is secondary, yet that land carries its own record, one of soil, water, and exposure. One that suggests Antarctica once behaved like a place rather than an exception. The idea of a permanently frozen south is a recent conclusion drawn from a short span of observation. When viewed across deep time, the continent shifts between states. Ice is dominant now, but it was not always so. The conditions that allowed ice to rule were assembled piece by piece. As the climate changed, access narrowed, routes closed, habitable zones vanished. Whatever patterns existed withdrew or ended. The ice advanced without intent, covering ground evenly, preserving contours rather than flattening them. Antarctica's present silence reflects its final state, not its entire history. The climate that shaped it was variable, patient, and slow. The continent did not resist ice, it accepted it over time. Beneath the frozen surface remains a memory of exposure, not a singular warm age, but many quieter intervals when land, water, and air interacted openly. Those intervals are recorded in pollen, sediment, and buried valleys. They are measurable, repeatable, and still under study. The climate did not always freeze the south. It shifted, paused, and eventually settled into cold. The ice is a conclusion, not an origin. What the ice is still hiding. Beneath Antarctica's ice sheet lies a landscape that has not been erased. It has been sealed. The thickness of the ice varies, but in many regions it exceeds 3 kilometers. Despite this depth, the surface below is not smooth or uniform. It is shaped, contoured, and structured in ways that suggest long exposure before burial. The first clear indications came from airborne radar surveys conducted in the mid-20th century. These surveys were designed to measure ice thickness, but they revealed something else. Beneath the ice were valleys, ridges, and basins extending across vast distances. These were not fractures caused by ice movement. They followed patterns consistent with erosion by flowing water. One of the most striking features identified is a network of river valleys beneath East Antarctica. Some stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Their slopes are shallow and continuous. Their branching patterns resemble river systems found on exposed continents. Glaciers can carve valleys, but they do so differently. Glacial erosion produces steep walls and U-shaped profiles. Many Antarctic subglacial valleys are narrow, sinuous, and V-shaped. These valleys converge into larger basins, some of which are now occupied by subglacial lakes. Lake Vostok is the most well-known. It lies beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice and covers an area comparable to one of the Great Lakes of North America. Its water remains liquid due to pressure and geothermal heat. Chemical analysis suggests it has been isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. Lake Vostok is not unique. More than 400 subglacial lakes have been identified across Antarctica. They are connected by slow-moving water systems that flow beneath the ice. These systems follow gradients set by the underlying terrain, not the ice surface above. This confirms that the land below still governs movement. Mountain ranges also persist beneath the ice. The Gamburtsev subglacial mountains, discovered in 1958, rise sharply from the buried surface. Their peaks are comparable in height to the European Alps. Their shape suggests they were once exposed to air and weather. Glaciers did not create them. They were already there before the ice arrived. Erosion patterns on these mountains indicate long periods of weathering. Rounded summits and fractured rock faces suggest cycles of freezing and thawing. These features form only when rock is exposed to atmosphere over extended time. Once buried beneath ice, such processes stop. In some regions, radar has revealed flat terraces cut into bedrock. These terraces resemble ancient shorelines. They appear at consistent elevations, suggesting former water levels maintained over long periods. Such features are common around lakes and seas on exposed continents. Beneath Antarctic ice, they raise questions about standing bodies of water that no longer exist on the surface. Sediment layers trapped beneath the ice provide further detail. In certain drilling sites, scientists have recovered fine-grained deposits that settle only in calm water. These layers alternate with coarser material, indicating cycles of flooding and drying. This pattern implies seasonal or long-term environmental rhythm rather than constant glacial cover. The ice sheet itself acts as a preservative. Unlike erosion by wind or rain, ice compresses without removing detail. Once land is sealed beneath it, change slows dramatically. Features that would vanish elsewhere remain intact. This makes Antarctica a geological archive rather than a blank slate. These discoveries have been catalogued primarily for their relevance to climate modelling. Their historical implications remain secondary. The language used in scientific papers is careful. Terms like pre-glacial and subglacial avoid speculation, yet the physical reality remains. The land beneath Antarctica once functioned as a surface. The scale of these features suggests long-term exposure. Rivers do not carve deep valleys in centuries. Mountains do not weather into rounded forms quickly. Shorelines require stable water levels sustained over time. These processes operate over tens of thousands of years or more. The question is not whether Antarctica was once exposed. That is now broadly accepted. The question is how exposed and for how long. Some regions may have remained ice-free even as others froze. The ice sheet did not advance evenly. It moved according to elevation, temperature, and precipitation. Coastal areas would have been the last to freeze and the first to thaw. These zones would also have been the most accessible. Radar surveys show extensive lowlands near the coast, now buried under ice shelves. These lowlands connect inland valleys to the sea, forming natural corridors. Such corridors are not evidence of human activity. They are evidence of possibility. They describe a landscape that could be traversed, followed, and reused. Any presence there would have adapted to cycles rather than permanence. Modern exploration has barely scratched the surface. Less than a fraction of Antarctica's subglacial terrain has been mapped in high resolution. Most data comes from wide-scale surveys optimized for ice behavior, not surface detail. Fine features remain unresolved. Drilling projects face logistical and ethical limits. Each borehole risks contaminating sealed ecosystems. As a result, direct sampling is rare and cautious. Much of what lies beneath is inferred rather than observed. Despite these limits, a coherent picture is emerging. Antarctica is not a simple mass of ice resting on featureless rock. It is a continent with history written into its surface. That history did not end when the ice arrived. It was paused. The ice moves slowly across this terrain, deforming without destroying. In some areas, it flows around ridges rather than flattening them. In others, it fills basins, sealing water below. The underlying shape remains legible. This preservation challenges assumptions about loss. Burial under ice does not mean erasure. It means delay. The record beneath Antarctica is not gone. It is waiting. What remains hidden is not dramatic in the conventional sense. There are no visible ruins or structures rising through the ice. There are patterns instead, shapes that imply long familiarity with air, water, and light. The land beneath Antarctica was shaped by ordinary processes, operating over extraordinary spans of time. Rivers flowed, lakes formed, mountains weathered. These processes require exposure. Exposure requires climate stability, even if temporary. The ice did not arrive as an event. It accumulated gradually, season by season. As it advanced, it covered what existed without judgment. It preserved the surface as it was, then locked it away. What the ice is hiding is not mystery for its own sake. It is continuity. A record of a continent behaving like any other before conditions shifted beyond return. Modern Antarctica appears silent and static. Beneath that stillness lies a surface that once responded to gravity, water, and erosion in familiar ways. That surface remains intact, measured, and slowly revealed through technology. The more that surface is mapped, the less Antarctica resembles an exception. It begins to resemble a place with a long, interrupted story. The problem of human presence. The question of human presence in Antarctica is often dismissed before it is examined. The continent is treated as an absolute boundary, a place beyond the limits of early movement. This conclusion is shaped by present conditions rather than past ones. When climate and geography are considered over long spans of time, the boundary becomes less fixed. Human migration has never followed a single pattern. It has responded to shifting coastlines, changing resources, and gradual environmental pressure. Groups moved when conditions allowed and withdrew when they did not. These movements were rarely permanent. Many left little trace, even in regions now well studied. Evidence from other extreme environments complicates assumptions about limits. In northern Eurasia, archaeological sites show human occupation above the Arctic Circle more than 30,000 years ago. These populations endured long winters, limited vegetation, and extended darkness. They adapted through mobility rather than settlement. Camps were seasonal, tools were portable, knowledge was stored in practice rather than structure. Similar patterns appear in high-altitude regions. Human presence in the Tibetan Plateau dates back at least 20,000 years. These environments required adaptation to thin air, cold temperatures, and short growing seasons. Occupation did not depend on comfort, it depended on predictability and access to resources. Antarctica during its warmer intervals would not have been hospitable in a modern sense. It would have been remote, windy, and isolated, yet parts of its coastline may have been seasonally accessible. Extended daylight during summer months would have supported limited activity. Marine life along exposed coasts could provide reliable food sources. The absence of known archaeological sites on the Antarctic mainland is often treated as decisive. However, the ice sheet itself prevents direct investigation. Any surface traces left before full glaciation would now lie beneath kilometers of ice. Unlike temperate regions, where erosion removes evidence, Antarctica preserves it beyond reach. Subantarctic islands offer limited comparison. Some contain evidence of transient human presence in later periods, including tool fragments and altered landscapes. These islands were stepping points rather than destinations. Their existence demonstrates that southern navigation occurred earlier than once assumed. During periods of lower sea level, distances between southern land masses were reduced. Exposed continental shelves extended coastlines outward. Travel between islands would have been shorter and more predictable. These changes occurred repeatedly during glacial cycles. Ocean conditions also mattered. Warmer periods altered currents and ice extent. Seasonal ice retreat could open coastal routes that are now permanently blocked. Such routes would not require advanced vessels. They would require timing and familiarity with patterns. Human movement into Antarctica, if it occurred, would likely have been limited and temporary. There is no need to assume large populations or permanent settlement. Seasonal presence leaves minimal physical trace, even in exposed environments. Under ice, that trace becomes inaccessible rather than erased. Tools used by such groups would have been organic or simple stone. Wood, bone, and fiber degrade over time unless sealed. Stone tools, if present, would be difficult to distinguish beneath glacial cover without direct excavation. Their absence in surface surveys does not indicate non-existence. Another complication lies in definition. Human presence does not require habitation. It can include travel, observation, and repeated visitation. Coastal use for hunting or fishing could occur without inland penetration. Such activity would focus on predictable zones rather than exploration. Ethnographic records show that many maritime cultures treated distant lands as seasonal grounds rather than places of residence. Knowledge of these areas was often restricted to specific groups. When conditions changed, access ended, and memory faded. The idea that Antarctica was always perceived as unreachable reflects modern hindsight. To early humans, geography was experienced gradually. Boundaries were discovered through repetition, not maps. A coastline accessible for generations could vanish within a few centuries due to ice advance, leaving no explanation. If access closed before written record, the loss would be silent. Later populations would inherit a world where the southern land existed only as rumour or outline. Over time, even that would fade. Scientific caution often frames the discussion as binary. Either humans were present or they were not. This framing overlooks degrees of interaction. Limited contact does not require proof equal to settlement. It requires only opportunity and repetition. The presence of subglacial valleys and exposed coastlines during warmer phases establishes opportunity. Known patterns of human adaptability establish plausibility. The remaining obstacle is evidence, which lies beyond current reach. Modern research has not prioritized this question. Antarctic study is shaped by international agreements focused on climate and geology. Archaeology is not a primary objective. Even if evidence existed beneath the ice, accessing it would raise ethical and logistical concerns. As a result, the question of human presence remains suspended. It is neither confirmed nor disproven. It exists in a narrow space defined by geology, climate, and known behavior. What complicates the issue further is the scale of time. Human presence could have occurred tens of thousands of years ago, then vanished completely. The continent could have remained empty for millennia afterward. Later, ice would preserve only the land, not the activity. The problem is not whether Antarctica could support life. It is whether it could support human movement long enough to leave memory rather than record. In other regions, similar movements are inferred rather than proven. Antarctica resists confirmation because it resists exposure. The ice denies surface access. Technology reveals form but not use. Valleys can be mapped, but paths cannot be followed. In this context, absence of evidence becomes ambiguous rather than decisive. It reflects limitation rather than conclusion. The land beneath remains sealed, holding its answers beyond present reach. The problem of human presence is therefore not a problem of belief. It is a problem of access. Until the ice yields its surface, the question remains suspended in geological time. What can be said is limited. Antarctica was once accessible in ways it is not now. Humans have repeatedly entered environments once thought impossible. Between these facts lies a narrow but persistent uncertainty. That uncertainty is not an invitation to certainty. It is a space where the known ends and the preserved begins. Memory without records. Human memory does not depend on writing. For most of human history, places were known without being named on paper. Routes existed without maps. Landscapes were carried forward through repetition, story, and habit. When access to a place ended, memory did not vanish at once. It thinned, shifted, and simplified. In societies without widespread literacy, knowledge moved through spoken form. Directions were encoded in rhythm. Distances were remembered as days rather than miles. Coastlines were recalled by sequence rather than shape. This kind of memory is durable when practiced and fragile when interrupted. When an environment changes slowly, people adapt without marking a single moment of loss. A coastline retreats year by year. A passage freezes earlier each season. Travel becomes harder, then unreliable, then impossible. By the time access ends completely, the change feels gradual rather than sudden. Memory adjusts quietly. Many ancient traditions describe lands that are no longer reachable. These descriptions are rarely precise. They are framed as distant, southern, or beyond familiar waters. The language is restrained. The places are not presented as fantastical. They are described as once-known regions that became closed. Such accounts are often dismissed as metaphor. Yet metaphor usually exaggerates. These traditions do not. They describe withdrawal, cooling, and separation. They speak of routes that no longer open and seas that no longer part. The tone is observational rather than symbolic. Geographic memory often outlasts physical access. In the Arctic, indigenous groups preserved knowledge of hunting grounds that became inaccessible after climate shifts. These places remained in oral record long after they could no longer be reached. The memory served no practical purpose, yet it endured. Similar patterns appear in island cultures. Oral traditions describe submerged lands and vanished coastlines consistent with post-glacial sea level rise. These stories were passed down for thousands of years before geological evidence confirmed them. Memory preserved outline where land no longer existed. This type of memory degrades in specific ways. Detail is lost first. Direction remains longer. The place becomes generalized. Eventually, only the idea persists. A land to the south. A place that was once open. A route that closed. Ancient geographic references often speak in these terms. They do not name Antarctica. They do not describe ice. They describe distance and absence. The southernmost land becomes a boundary rather than a destination. It is acknowledged, then avoided. As cultures reorganize around new environments, older routes lose relevance. Knowledge not used becomes compressed. What was once a detailed mental map becomes a single statement. Beyond this point lies land that cannot be reached. Written records, when they appear later, capture only fragments of this inherited understanding. Early scholars often treated such references as philosophical constructs rather than geography. They were copied, categorized, and abstracted. This abstraction is visible in early cosmological texts. The world is divided into zones. The southernmost zone is acknowledged, then set aside. It is described as real but impractical. Its climate is extreme. Its access uncertain. Its relevance minimal. This framing mirrors what happens when memory outlives access. The place is not denied. It is deprioritized. Over time, it becomes theoretical rather than experiential. Maps created from inherited knowledge reflect this process. Coastlines are drawn, but interiors are left blank. Rivers appear without sources. Mountains are implied without detail. These are not errors. They are signs of partial memory. The repetition of a southern land across independent traditions suggests shared inheritance rather than coincidence. The form changes, but the concept remains. A southern boundary that once mattered, then ceased to. When writing replaces oral transmission, compression accelerates. Text preserves what seems relevant at the time of writing. Peripheral knowledge is shortened or removed. What survives is often misunderstood by later readers. This process explains why ancient geographic references often appear vague. They are not vague at origin. They are vague by survival. They are the residue of something once detailed. The absence of explicit records about southern exploration does not indicate absence of experience. It indicates loss of continuity. Knowledge that cannot be practiced decays faster than knowledge that can. In this sense, Antarctica may not have vanished from memory abruptly. It may have slipped gradually into abstraction, first as a place reached rarely, then as a place remembered, then as a place assumed. By the time formal cartography emerged, the memory had already thinned. What remained were outlines and inherited claims. These were copied without explanation. Their meaning was no longer interrogated. When later explorers failed to confirm these outlines, the inherited memory was discarded. The maps were revised. The old knowledge was labelled speculative. the cycle completed. Memory without records does not survive scrutiny well. It lacks evidence by definition. Yet it persists long enough to influence belief and representation. Antarctica's early presence in geographic thought may reflect this process. A land once encountered during favorable conditions, access narrowed, memory compressed, outline preserved, meaning lost. This interpretation does not require advanced civilization or deliberate concealment. It requires only time, climate change, and ordinary human forgetting. The continent's remoteness accelerates this process. Unlike submerged coastlines near populated areas, Antarctica moved beyond reach entirely. There was no gradual re-encounter. There was no rediscovery until modern times. When rediscovery occurred, it happened under different conditions. Ice replaced shoreline. The inherited memory no longer matched observation. The older knowledge was set aside. What survives now are fragments scattered across disciplines, in maps, in climate records, in oral traditions interpreted loosely. None provide confirmation alone. Together, they suggest continuity of awareness rather than invention. Memory does not preserve certainty. It preserves direction. It points without explaining. Antarctica may have remained in human thought as a direction long after it ceased to be a place. The loss of records does not imply the absence of experience. It implies that experience ended before it could be fixed in durable form. The ice that sealed the continent also sealed the question. What remains is not evidence, but pattern. A recurring southern absence noted across cultures, then forgotten. Memory without records fades unevenly. It leaves shadows rather than statements. Antarctica's early place in human awareness may exist now only as such a shadow. That shadow is not proof. It is residue. Why nothing remains on the surface? The absence of visible traces on Antarctica is often treated as a conclusion rather than a condition. The surface appears empty, wind-scoured, and uniform. This appearance encourages the assumption that nothing was ever there. Yet the processes that shape Antarctica do not remove evidence in the same way as those in temperate regions. They conceal it. Glaciation does not function like erosion by water or wind. It does not gradually wear structures down until they vanish. Instead, it covers. Ice accumulates layer by layer, pressing downward with immense force. Objects beneath are not scattered, they are sealed in place. In regions where glaciers advance and retreat repeatedly, surface traces may be destroyed. Antarctica differs because much of its ice sheet has remained stable for tens of thousands of years. Once land was buried beneath continuous ice, change slowed dramatically. The surface entered a state of suspension. The thickness of the Antarctic ice sheet is central to this effect. In many areas, it exceeds 3 kilometers. This mass insulates what lies beneath from atmospheric interaction. Wind cannot reach it. Water cannot wash it away. Ultraviolet radiation does not degrade it. Biological activity becomes minimal. In temperate environments, traces of early human activity disappear quickly. Wood rots, bone dissolves, stone tools are displaced by soil movement, vegetation grows and dies repeatedly. In Antarctica, these cycles are halted. The ice interrupts them. This interruption alters the archaeological equation. Evidence is not lost through decay. It is rendered inaccessible. The distinction matters. Absence on the surface does not imply absence in the record. It implies burial beyond reach. The movement of Antarctic ice is slow and predictable. Ice flows outward from the interior toward the coast, at rates measured in meters per year. This movement deforms without fragmenting. Features beneath are compressed vertically rather than dragged horizontally. The land remains legible beneath the ice. Where ice does erode, it does so selectively. High points are scraped, valleys are filled, flat areas are preserved more completely than ridges. Any activity concentrated in low-lying coastal zones, would be among the last to be destroyed and the first to be sealed. As ice thickens, pressure increases. This pressure can preserve detail by limiting chemical reaction. Organic material becomes frozen in place. Stone remains unchanged. Metal, if present, corrodes slowly in the absence of oxygen. Time passes differently beneath ice. Examples of such preservation exist elsewhere. In Greenland, ancient landscapes have been discovered beneath ice that remained undisturbed for millions of years. Soil layers, plant roots, and insect remains were found intact once exposed. Antarctica's ice sheet is larger and colder, increasing this effect. The final sealing of Antarctica occurred gradually. As climate cooled, snowfall increased. Summers shortened. Meltwater refroze earlier each year. Over centuries, snow compacted into ice. Features on the surface were not swept away. They were entombed. Once sealed, the surface ceased to be a surface. It became a boundary layer between two states. Above it, ice moved slowly. Below it, time slowed almost to a halt. This explains why no ruins, tools, or structures are visible today. The ice sheet has not allowed exposure. Where coastal rock does appear, it is often scoured by moving ice or isolated by cliffs. These exposures do not represent former lowlands where activity would concentrate. Most human use of any landscape occurs near water. Antarctica's ancient rivers, lakes, and coastlines are now buried beneath ice shelves and inland ice. These areas are precisely those least likely to be exposed by modern melting. Even significant warming would not reveal such sites quickly. Ice melts unevenly. It retreats from high ground first. Low basins remain sealed longest. The places most likely to preserve evidence are the last to surface. The Antarctic Treaty further limits exploration. Excavation is restricted. Drilling is tightly controlled. Preservation of the environment takes precedence over investigation. This ensures that even if evidence was suspected, recovery would be slow and controversial. Modern remote sensing reveals form, not content. Radar shows valleys, ridges, and basins. It cannot identify small-scale features. A campsite, path, or tool scatter would be invisible at current resolution. Seismic surveys penetrate deeper, but remain coarse. They map layers, not objects. They confirm that surfaces exist beneath the ice, but not what rests upon them. This creates a paradox. Antarctica is one of the most preserved landscapes on Earth and one of the least accessible. Its record is intact but sealed. In other regions, the absence of evidence often results from exposure and reuse. In Antarctica, absence results from protection. The ice does not erase history, it defers it. This deferral challenges how conclusions are drawn. Archaeology depends on exposure. Antarctica denies exposure by design of nature rather than intent. The assumption that nothing remains on the surface is therefore accurate but incomplete. Nothing remains visible. Everything remains buried. The deeper the ice, the more complete the preservation. Pressure stabilizes temperature. Darkness halts biological processes. Water movement ceases. The land becomes static. This condition is unique. Most ancient landscapes have been altered repeatedly by climate, vegetation, and human reuse. Antarctica's buried surface has experienced none of these forces for immense spans of time. If activity occurred during warmer intervals, its traces would be among the most well-preserved on the planet. They would also be among the most unreachable. The logic applies equally to natural and cultural features. Riverbanks, shorelines, campsites, and travel corridors would be preserved as they were when sealed. Their context would remain intact rather than fragmented. The ice sheet functions as a lid placed gently but firmly over the continent. Once closed, it does not reopen easily. This lid explains both the preservation and the silence. The lack of surface evidence does not falsify the possibility of earlier activity. It explains why the question persists without resolution. Antarctica presents a record that cannot be read using ordinary methods. It requires indirect inference, patience, and acceptance of uncertainty. The surface today tells only the final chapter. Everything before it lies below, unweathered and unexamined. This is why nothing remains on the surface, not because nothing occurred, but because the surface itself no longer exists in the way it once did. The ice replaced it, a civilization without monuments. When the word civilization is used, it often implies stone walls, written records, and permanent cities. This definition is shaped by what survives rather than what once existed. Most human societies did not build for permanence. They organized life around movement, season, and reuse. Their presence was real, but their material footprint was light. For most of human history, survival depended on adaptability rather than construction. Groups followed animals, coastlines, and weather patterns. Shelters were temporary. Tools were carried rather than stored. When conditions changed, camps were abandoned without ceremony. Nothing was left behind intentionally. Archaeology has documented many such societies. In coastal regions, repeated occupation left only thin layers of debris, shell fragments, hearth stains, scattered stone tools. These traces are often difficult to identify even when exposed. Under ice, they would be invisible. Monument-building cultures are rare exceptions rather than the rule. They appear under specific conditions: stable climate, surplus food, dense population, and long-term territorial control. Antarctica, even during warmer intervals, would not support these conditions. Any human presence there would follow a different model. A non-monumental culture leaves no skyline. It leaves patterns instead, paths worn into soil, repeated use of the same shoreline, preferred landing points, seasonal return to familiar places. These patterns are subtle and easily erased or buried. In regions later covered by ice, such patterns would be sealed rather than destroyed. But sealing does not make them detectable. Without excavation, they remain indistinguishable from natural features. Stone tools are often treated as definitive markers of human presence, yet stone use varies widely. Some groups relied heavily on organic materials, such as bone, wood, and fiber. These degrade quickly unless frozen. Antarctica's ice would preserve them, but only beneath layers impossible to reach. Fire leaves marks, but these marks fade. Charcoal disperses. Ash is carried by wind or water. After burial beneath snow and ice, hearth traces compress into thin, darkened layers difficult to distinguish from natural sediment without direct sampling. Even repeated occupation does not guarantee recognizable evidence. Many Paleolithic sites were identified only after decades of excavation. Some were initially dismissed as natural deposits. Interpretation depends on exposure and context. Antarctica offers neither. Its ice sheet hides context entirely. Features cannot be examined in sequence. Layers cannot be peeled back. The land is locked beneath pressure that preserves but conceals. The absence of monuments, therefore, tells little. It reflects expectation rather than reality. If early humans entered Antarctica, they would not announce themselves in stone. They would leave behind habits, not buildings. The term civilization may itself be misleading in this context. It suggests hierarchy, permanence, and growth. A more accurate model would be culture, a system of knowledge, movement, and adaptation tuned to environment rather than territory. Such cultures can be sophisticated without being visible. Navigation, seasonal timing, toolmaking, and social memory require coordination and transmission. None require architecture. Evidence from maritime societies shows this clearly. Some coastal cultures traveled vast distances without leaving permanent settlements. Their presence is known primarily through indirect signs, modified landscapes, transported materials, altered ecosystems. If a similar pattern occurred in Antarctica, it would focus on the coast. Marine resources would dominate. Inland movement would be limited. Presence would be episodic, not continuous. As climate cooled and ice advanced, these patterns would compress. Landing points would vanish beneath ice shelves, familiar routes would close. Return would become impossible. The culture would withdraw without collapse. What would remain is not abandonment debris, but silence. No broken cities, no ruined walls, just land sealed at the moment of departure. Modern archaeology is biased toward visibility. It favors stone, metal, and permanence. Cultures that do not produce these are underrepresented even in exposed regions. Under ice, they vanish entirely from view. This bias shapes conclusions. The absence of monumental remains is interpreted as absence of presence. Yet this logic fails in environments where preservation favors burial over exposure. Antarctica inverts the usual archaeological problem. Instead of erosion destroying evidence, preservation hides it completely. The better preserved the surface, the less accessible it becomes. A civilization without monuments fits this inversion. Its traces would be intact but unreachable. Its absence on the surface would be expected rather than surprising. This perspective aligns with known patterns elsewhere. In northern regions, affected by glaciation, early human activity is often inferred indirectly. Migration routes are reconstructed from genetics and climate rather than artifacts. Direct evidence is rare. Antarctica extends this pattern to an extreme. The ice removes not only artifacts, but the possibility of finding them. Interpretation must rely on context rather than discovery. The idea of a culture without monuments also challenges how significance is measured. Importance is often equated with scale, yet many influential human adaptations occurred quietly. Mastery of navigation, understanding of seasonal cycles, coordination across distance, these developments leave little material trace. Their impact is measured in continuity rather than construction. If Antarctica was used temporarily during favorable intervals, it would not reshape global history. It would exist at the margins. Its significance would lie in what it reveals about adaptability rather than achievement. This marginality explains why no record persisted. Cultures remember what sustains them. A region that becomes inaccessible does not remain central to identity. Over generations, knowledge of such a place would thin. What was once practiced would become remembered, then assumed, then ignored. By the time writing emerged, the experience would already be distant. What survived would be fragments without context. A civilization without monuments leaves no ruins to rediscover. It leaves questions instead. Questions shaped by what remains visible and what does not. Antarctica's silence does not contradict the possibility of earlier presence. It aligns with it. Silence is what remains when departure is gradual and preservation is complete. The land beneath the ice would not testify loudly. It would wait without markers. This waiting defines the Antarctic problem. The record exists, but it does not announce itself. It does not conform to expectation. It does not offer confirmation easily. The idea of a civilization without monuments does not require rewriting history. It requires loosening definitions. It requires acknowledging that presence and permanence are not the same. Antarctica may never reveal such a presence directly. The ice may never lift far enough. Technology may never permit excavation without destruction. If so, the question will remain unresolved. Not because it was impossible, but because it was quiet. Some histories do not end in ruins. They end in withdrawal. The final sealing of the South. The transition from a marginally accessible continent to a permanently sealed one did not occur in a single event. It unfolded through accumulation. Snow fell, lingered longer each year, and compressed under its own weight. Ice did not arrive as a wall. It arrived as persistence. As global temperatures declined near the end of the last ice age, Antarctica crossed a threshold. Summers shortened. Melt seasons became unreliable. Snow that once receded now remained. Over centuries, layers stacked and hardened. Firn became ice. Ice thickened into a sheet that no longer responded to seasonal change. This process was uneven. High interior regions froze first. Low coastal zones resisted longer. These coastal margins had moderated temperatures due to ocean contact. For a time, they remained exposed, while the interior vanished beneath ice. This created a narrowing ring of access around the continent. As ice thickened inland, it began to flow outward under its own weight. This movement was slow but constant. Valleys filled, lowlands disappeared. Rivers that once drained to the sea were cut off and sealed. Water pooled beneath ice rather than flowing across land. Ice shelves formed along the coast. These shelves extended outward over the ocean, grounding in shallow areas. Where shelves touched the seabed, they blocked access entirely. Even where open water remained beyond, the coastline itself was no longer reachable. The formation of a continuous circumpolar current accelerated this sealing. Once established, this current isolated Antarctica thermally. Warm water from lower latitudes was diverted away. Cold water circulated endlessly around the continent. This locked the climate into a stable frozen state. Wind patterns followed. Katabatic winds intensified as cold air flowed downslope from the interior. These winds scoured exposed areas and redistributed snow, thickening ice in some regions while stripping it from others. The result was not uniform burial, but comprehensive coverage. The final sealing did not mean the end of all change. Ice continued to move. Basal melting occurred in some regions due to geothermal heat. Subglacial lakes formed and connected, yet the surface no longer returned. The land remained hidden. For any groups using the continent seasonally, this transition would have been perceptible. Landing points would become unreliable. Familiar routes would ice over earlier. Return trips would carry increasing risk. Over time, the margin for error would vanish. Withdrawal under such conditions would not be sudden, it would be incremental. One season missed, then another. Knowledge would remain for a time, but without reinforcement it would fade. The place would shift from usable to remembered. The sealing of the South also coincided with global reorganization. Rising sea levels altered coastlines elsewhere. Populations migrated inland or toward newly formed shores. Attention shifted northward. The southern margins became irrelevant to survival. This shift matters because human memory is selective. Places that no longer provide resources lose priority. Even significant experiences can fade if they no longer connect to daily life. Antarctica would not remain central once it could no longer be reached. Written records, where they existed, focused on places of exchange and continuity. The South offered neither once sealed. It did not disappear violently, it simply stopped mattering. From a geological perspective, the sealing was efficient. Ice filled basins completely. Pressure flattened loose sediments. Water pathways were redirected beneath ice rather than across surface. The land entered a closed system. Once sealed, the continent became resistant to reopening. Even during later warm periods, the ice sheet remained largely intact. Melting occurred at edges, but the interior persisted. The threshold had been crossed. This persistence explains why Antarctica appears timeless today. The ice has outlasted multiple climate oscillations. It has stabilized the continent in a frozen state that feels permanent on human timescales. The ceiling also explains the absence of layered cultural history. There are no successive occupations visible, no reuse of sites, no accumulation of debris. Everything before the ice belongs to a single buried phase. In other regions affected by glaciation, ice retreated and returned. Landscapes were reoccupied. Evidence was overwritten. Antarctica did not experience this cycle. Once sealed, it remained closed. This closure is key. It transformed the continent from a place into a boundary, from something that could be approached into something that could only be imagined. The final sealing did not require catastrophe. It required patience. Climate shifted gradually. Ice did what ice does when given time and consistency. It accumulated. The result is not erasure, but suspension. The continent beneath remains as it was at the moment access ended. Its rivers stopped flowing, but their channels remain. Its shorelines disappeared, but their contours persist. The sealing also locked Antarctica out of history, as history is usually written. Events require witnesses. Change requires interaction. Antarctica experienced neither after the ice stabilized. This absence of interaction created a gap, a place that existed physically but not socially, known in outline, unknown in experience. Modern science approaches Antarctica as a system rather than a place. Ice dynamics, climate feedback, sea level contribution. These frameworks are valid but incomplete. They focus on the present function rather than the past role. The sealing of the South transformed the continent's role entirely. It shifted from environment to archive, from space of movement to space of storage. What it stores is not a single story, but many overlapping processes paused at once. Climate history, geological formation, potential human interaction, all compressed beneath the same lid. The lid remains intact. Even as edges melt slightly under modern warming, the interior holds. The final sealing has not been reversed. This endurance ensures that whatever existed before remains preserved. It also ensures that access remains unlikely. The sealing of the South is therefore both an ending and a condition. It ended interaction. It created preservation. The continent did not vanish. It withdrew. What followed was silence, not because nothing remained, but because nothing could return. Why the question still matters. The question of Antarctica's buried past persists because it sits at the edge of several disciplines without belonging fully to any of them. Climate science measures ice and temperature. Geology maps rock and sediment. Archaeology searches for material trace. Antarctica resists each approach in a different way. What lies beneath the ice cannot be tested directly, yet it cannot be dismissed without assumption. Modern historical method depends on access. Sites are excavated. Layers are exposed. Objects are catalogued. Antarctica denies this sequence. The continent presents a record that is intact but sealed. It forces interpretation to rely on indirect evidence rather than discovery. This condition matters because it challenges how certainty is assigned. In most regions, absence of evidence can eventually be corrected through excavation. In Antarctica, absence may remain permanent. Conclusions drawn there are shaped by limitation rather than resolution. The question also matters because Antarctica is not unique in this respect. It represents an extreme version of a broader problem. Many early human activities occurred in environments later altered beyond recognition. Coastlines submerged, forests buried, ice advanced. In these cases, history is inferred rather than observed. Antarctica concentrates this problem into a single place. Its scale and preservation make the gap between possibility and proof unusually clear. The land beneath is known to exist in detail. Its features are mapped. Its exposure in the past is documented. What cannot be confirmed is use. This gap invites reflection on how history is defined. If history requires artifacts, then Antarctica has none. If history includes interaction, movement, and adaptation, then the question remains open. The definition chosen determines the conclusion reached. The persistence of this question also reflects the limits of technological progress. Radar, seismic imaging, and satellite observation have revealed the continent's shape. They have not revealed its surface detail. Resolution stops at form. Content remains hidden. Future technology may narrow this gap. It may allow finer imaging beneath ice. It may permit targeted sampling without contamination. Yet even these advances would face ethical and logistical barriers. Antarctica is protected precisely because it preserves what cannot be replaced. This protection ensures that some questions will remain unanswered by design. The continent is treated as a global archive. Disturbing it requires justification beyond curiosity. As a result, historical inquiry remains secondary to preservation. The question still matters because it tests how inference is handled when confirmation is impossible. It reveals whether history can tolerate uncertainty without defaulting to denial. Antarctica also occupies a symbolic position. It represents the edge of the known world in modern imagination. To suggest that it once functioned like other continents unsettles that image. It shifts Antarctica from exception to participant. This shift does not require extraordinary claims. It requires only acceptance of variability. Climate changed, land was exposed, access existed. These points are supported by evidence. What follows from them remains undecided. The discomfort arises not from the possibility of presence, but from the inability to resolve it. The question resists closure. It remains suspended between plausibility and proof. Such suspension is rare in historical discourse. Most questions move toward resolution as evidence accumulates. Antarctica resists accumulation. It preserves evidence while withholding it. This resistance highlights a broader issue. History is often written from what survives rather than what occurred. Survival depends on environment as much as on activity. Antarctica's environment favors preservation but denies retrieval. The continent therefore exposes bias in historical record. Regions that erode quickly appear empty. Regions that preserve but conceal appear silent. Neither condition reflects absence of activity. This matters because conclusions drawn from these biases shape understanding of human capability. They define perceived limits of movement, adaptation, and exploration. Antarctica sits at the extreme of those perceived limits. If early humans could adapt to environments once thought impossible, then the boundary of human movement shifts. This does not rewrite known history. It reframes its margins. The question also matters because it encourages caution in interpreting maps, myths, and inherited knowledge. These sources are often dismissed when they cannot be verified. Yet Antarctica demonstrates how verification can be prevented by conditions rather than falsehood. When older geographic knowledge conflicts with modern observation, the difference may reflect change rather than error. Antarctica's climate changed dramatically. Earlier descriptions may not match present conditions. This perspective does not elevate ancient sources above modern science. It places them in context. It treats them as partial records rather than fantasies. The continued relevance of this question also lies in its restraint. It does not demand belief. It invites consideration. It asks how conclusions are reached when evidence is sealed but not erased. Antarctica will remain frozen for the foreseeable future. The land beneath will remain buried. The question of what occurred there before the ice will not be answered through excavation. As a result, the question becomes methodological rather than factual. How should history treat places that cannot be accessed? How much weight should be given to indirect evidence? When does uncertainty remain acceptable? These questions extend beyond Antarctica. They apply to submerged coastlines, eroded landscapes, and regions altered by catastrophe. Antarctica simply makes the problem visible. The question still matters because it exposes the limits of certainty without resorting to speculation. It occupies a narrow space where evidence suggests possibility but denies confirmation. In that space, restraint becomes necessary. The continent does not offer resolution. It offers boundary. Antarctica remains a place where the past is preserved without being available. Its relevance lies not in what can be proven, but in what cannot be ruled out without assumption. The question persists because the land beneath the ice remains intact. It has not been destroyed. It has been deferred. As long as that deferral continues, the question remains open. The bottom of the world as archive. Antarctica is often described as empty, but in physical terms, it is dense with information. The ice sheet that covers the continent is not uniform matter. It is layered, compressed, and ordered. Each layer marks time passing without interruption. Snow fell, settled, and hardened. Air was trapped, dust was sealed. What accumulated did not mix freely. It stacked. This structure turns Antarctica into an archive rather than a landscape. Archives do not display their contents openly. They preserve them in sequence. Access requires deliberate intrusion. Until that happens, the material remains intact but unread. Ice cores illustrate this clearly. Cylinders extracted from the ice contain distinct annual layers stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. These layers preserve atmospheric composition, volcanic ash, and trace chemicals. They show how the planet breathed in the past. They also show how slowly Antarctica changed. Below these atmospheric records lies another archive, the buried surface. Unlike ice, which is dynamic at its margins, the bedrock beneath is stable. It preserves the final exposed state of the continent before sealing. River channels remain where water last flowed. Shorelines remain where waves last broke. Soil remains where vegetation last took hold. This preservation is passive. There was no intent to store. Conditions simply aligned. Cold reduced chemical reaction. Pressure limited movement. Darkness halted biological cycles. The land entered a suspended state. Archives function by exclusion. What they hold is preserved because it is isolated. Antarctica's isolation is extreme. Distance, weather, and international regulation combine to limit access. The archive is protected not by walls, but by scale. Unlike written archives, Antarctica does not prioritize relevance. It preserves everything equally. Climate data, geological structure, and potential surface activity are sealed together. No selection occurred at the moment of burial. This lack of selection complicates interpretation. In written records, emphasis guides reading. In Antarctica, everything remains without annotation. Meaning must be inferred indirectly. The concept of Antarctica as archive reframes its role in history. It is not merely a location where events did or did not occur. It is a storage medium that captured a moment and held it unchanged. This storage includes processes that normally erase evidence. Rivers stopped flowing before they could shift course. Soil stopped cycling before roots could break it down. Organic matter froze before decay completed. Time continued above, but slowed below. In other parts of the world, deep time is reconstructed through fragments. Erosion destroys context. Deposition overwrites earlier layers. Human reuse disturbs sequence. Antarctica avoided these processes by becoming inaccessible early. As a result, its archive is unusually coherent. Features align logically. Valleys connect to basins. Shorelines correspond to elevation. The landscape reads as a single frozen frame rather than a collage. This coherence does not confirm any particular narrative. It establishes potential. A preserved surface can hold evidence of many kinds: geological, ecological, or cultural. The archive does not distinguish between them. Modern science approaches Antarctica cautiously for this reason. Any intervention alters the archive. Drilling creates contamination risk. Excavation disturbs sequence. Even movement across the surface introduces change. International agreements reflect this awareness. Antarctica is treated as a shared resource. Preservation is prioritized over extraction. Knowledge gained must justify intrusion. This approach protects climate records effectively. It also limits historical inquiry. The archive remains largely sealed by choice as well as by ice. In this sense, Antarctica represents a different relationship between history and evidence. Elsewhere, exposure is assumed. Here, concealment is the default. Interpretation must adapt. Indirect reading becomes essential. Subglacial topography suggests long-term exposure. Pollen implies vegetation. Ice thickness implies accumulation rate. These signals combine to form a picture without revealing specific events. This method is uncomfortable for disciplines accustomed to artifacts. It requires accepting ambiguity. The archive speaks in gradients rather than statements. The bottom of the world also archives absence. The moment access ended is preserved as sharply as any presence. Routes stopped being used. Shorelines stopped being visited. That cessation is part of the record. Most historical narratives focus on beginnings and expansions. Antarctica records withdrawal. It shows what happens when a place exits human systems without conflict or collapse. This withdrawal leaves little narrative trace. No ruins mark departure, no debris accumulates. The archive captures stillness rather than drama. Such stillness is difficult to interpret. It lacks contrast. It does not privilege human activity over natural process. It preserves both equally. The archive also resists dating of surface use. Ice sealing obscures final exposure dates unevenly. Some regions froze earlier, others later. A single timeline does not apply across the continent. This variability complicates conclusions. Presence in one region does not imply presence in another. Absence in one does not negate access elsewhere. The archive preserves these differences without clarifying them. Antarctica therefore challenges linear thinking. It requires regional, conditional interpretation. It rewards restraint. The archive metaphor also clarifies why certainty remains elusive. Archives do not answer questions by themselves. They require access, context, and interpretation. Antarctica denies the first and complicates the others. What remains available is structure, the shape of land, the layering of ice, the alignment of features. These indicate what was possible, not what occurred. Possibility is often excluded from historical analysis. Yet in Antarctica, possibility is the highest resolution available. The archive supports or limits scenarios without confirming them. This does not weaken its value. It defines it. Antarctica is an archive of constraints. It shows what the environment allowed at specific times. Within those allowances, activity may or may not have occurred. Understanding those constraints matters. It refines assumptions about limits. It clarifies when access existed and when it ended. It defines the window within which any interaction must fit. The bottom of the world as archive also reframes discovery. Antarctica was not discovered in the 19th century. It was encountered under conditions that hid its archive. The encounter revealed ice, not history. Only later did technology allow partial reading. Even now, the reading remains incomplete. This incompleteness is not failure. It is a condition. Antarctica preserves without yielding. It stores without revealing. It holds information without narrative. In this way, The continent operates differently from other historical spaces. It does not invite interpretation, it tolerates it. The archive remains closed not because it is empty, but because opening it carries cost. Preservation has been chosen over certainty. As a result, Antarctica occupies a unique position. It is a place where history exists without confirmation, where evidence is present without access, where the past remains intact but unread. This condition ensures that questions will persist, not because answers are hidden deliberately, but because the archive does not prioritize them. The bottom of the world keeps its record evenly, without emphasis or explanation. It waits. What would change everything? For most questions in history, progress follows a familiar path. Evidence is found, tested, debated, and eventually accepted or rejected. Antarctica does not allow this sequence. Its buried surface places a hard limit on what can be known. As a result, the idea of change takes on a different meaning. Change does not depend on interpretation alone, it depends on access. The first category of change would be technological. Current imaging tools reveal shape but not detail. Radar outlines valleys, ridges, and basins. Seismic surveys show layers and density. Neither can resolve objects, surfaces, or traces of activity at human scale. A shift would require instruments capable of distinguishing material differences beneath kilometers of ice without disturbing them. Such tools are often discussed in theory. Higher frequency radar, quantum sensing, passive imaging using ambient vibrations. These ideas remain experimental. Even if developed, their application in Antarctica would face limits. Ice thickness varies. Signal interference increases with depth. Resolution improves slowly. Technology alone would not be sufficient. Any instrument that identified potential cultural traces would raise immediate questions about verification. Confirmation requires sampling. Sampling requires penetration. Penetration risks contamination and disturbance. Antarctica's value as a climate archive makes such risks difficult to justify. A second category of change would be climatic. Significant melting could expose buried surfaces. This possibility is often mentioned indirectly, but rarely examined in historical terms. Melting would not occur evenly. Ice retreats from high ground first. Lowlands, where surface use would concentrate, remain sealed longest. Even extensive warming would expose only fragments. Coastal rock might emerge. Interior basins would stay buried. Any exposure would be partial and unstable. Meltwater would erode newly exposed features quickly. The archive would begin to degrade as soon as it opened. This creates a paradox. The conditions required to reveal the past would also destroy it. Exposure brings erosion. Stability requires concealment. Antarctica preserves history precisely because it does not reveal it. A third form of change would involve policy. International agreements govern activity on the continent. These agreements prioritize preservation. Archaeological exploration is not prohibited, but it is not encouraged. Any proposal to excavate would require consensus, oversight, and justification beyond curiosity. Such justification would likely depend on prior indication, a confirmed anomaly, a signal strong enough to suggest non-natural origin. Without this, policy will continue to favor restraint. Another potential shift lies in interpretation rather than discovery. A change in how indirect evidence is weighted could alter conclusions. This would not produce confirmation, but it could change confidence thresholds. Patterns now treated as coincidence might be treated as meaningful correlation. This shift would be methodological rather than factual. It would involve accepting that certain questions cannot be resolved by direct evidence. It would require comfort with inference that remains provisional. Such comfort is rare in historical discourse. Certainty is often valued over plausibility. Antarctica challenges this preference. It forces consideration of scenarios that fit evidence without resolving it. A further possibility involves comparative research. As more buried landscapes are studied elsewhere, models of preservation improve. Greenland offers one example. Landscapes preserved beneath ice that have been exposed and studied. They demonstrate that surfaces can remain intact for millions of years. If similar preservation is confirmed repeatedly, confidence in Antarctic preservation increases. This does not reveal content, but it strengthens assumptions about condition. Genetic research also offers indirect pathways. Population genetics can trace migration routes and bottlenecks. If future studies suggest southern movement patterns unexplained by known geography, Antarctica may re-enter discussion indirectly. Such signals would be subtle. They would not point to place directly. They would indicate absence elsewhere, gaps that require explanation. Yet, even this would not confirm presence. It would only refine plausibility. The most decisive change would be an unambiguous discovery. An artifact exposed naturally, a structure revealed by retreating ice, a surface feature inconsistent with geology. Such a discovery would shift discussion immediately. The likelihood of this remains low. Exposure is rare, observation is limited. Even when ice retreats, human presence is sparse. Detection would require coincidence as much as process. History shows that such coincidences occur unpredictably. Discoveries often arise outside planned research. They are recognized only after the fact. Antarctica's remoteness reduces this probability further. Another form of change would be conceptual, a redefinition of what counts as evidence. If history expanded its scope to include possibility constrained by environment, Antarctica's status would shift. This would not elevate speculation. It would formalize uncertainty. It would allow certain questions to remain open without being dismissed. Such a change would not resolve Antarctica's past. It would acknowledge its indeterminacy as legitimate rather than problematic. This matters because unresolved questions shape boundaries of thought. They define where knowledge ends and assumption begins. Antarctica sits precisely at that boundary. The question of what would change everything, therefore, has no simple answer. Change could come from technology, climate, policy, interpretation, or chance. Each path carries limits. Each introduces trade-offs. It is possible that nothing will change decisively. The archive may remain sealed indefinitely. In that case, Antarctica's past will remain inferred rather than known. This outcome does not represent failure. It reflects the nature of the place. Some environments preserve without yielding. Some questions remain suspended by condition rather than lack of effort. Antarctica's role may therefore remain conceptual rather than factual. It will continue to test assumptions about access, evidence, and certainty. The continent does not invite resolution. It enforces restraint. It places a ceiling on what can be claimed responsibly. In this context, the question of change becomes less about discovery and more about acceptance. Acceptance that some histories exist beyond confirmation. Acceptance that preservation does not guarantee revelation. The ice ensures that Antarctica remains a limit case, a place where possibility is high and proof is low, where evidence exists but cannot be examined. This balance may persist for centuries. Technological optimism does not override physical constraint easily. Ethical restraint adds another layer. If change comes, it will come slowly. It will arrive as improved imaging rather than exposure, as refined models rather than artifacts, as narrowed uncertainty rather than closure. Such change would not transform Antarctica into a solved problem. It would adjust its position within inquiry. What would change everything is not a single discovery, but a shift in how unresolved histories are treated. Antarctica challenges the expectation that all questions must yield answers. It demonstrates that some records are preserved precisely because they remain closed. In that sense, Antarctica already changed something fundamental. It altered how history encounters limits. Whether further change occurs depends less on the continent than on how inquiry adapts to it. The ice will remain. The archive will persist. The question will stay open as long as access does not exceed preservation. This condition defines Antarctica's role. It is not a puzzle awaiting solution. It is a boundary that clarifies how knowledge ends. Change may come, or it may not. Either outcome leaves the continent as it is now, preserved, silent, and unresolved. Antarctica remains covered, not because it lacks history, but because its history is locked beneath conditions that favor preservation over exposure. The land below the ice has not been destroyed or reshaped beyond recognition. It has been paused. Science continues to measure its form, its climate record, and its boundaries, while the surface remains out of reach. This leaves questions unresolved by design rather than neglect. The continent stands as a reminder that not all pasts can be recovered, and not all evidence can be examined directly. Some histories remain inferred, constrained by environment rather than silence. If this exploration of Antarctica's buried past reshaped how you think about limits, evidence, and what qualifies as history, continue with the series. Each chapter builds quietly on the last. Subscribe for future episodes, and allow the unanswered to remain part of the story.